Oh, hello, Professor
I'm Nadia.
Martini.
Hi.
Very pleased to meet you. How are you? Thank you very much, Professor Maftouni, for this invitation to speak to the Iranian film scholars and philosophers of art who are interested in cinema. It's a really tremendous pleasure. As some of you may know, I was hoping to get to Iran. It would have been just not so many, like less than 2 years ago when I was blocked by my government from being able to come, and I regret that missed opportunity. But now I can speak to everybody and say something about the ideas that have kept me going and how they've developed. My position has been pretty significant, I'm proud to say at this point, but not because of particularly things that I have done through any kind of special brilliance, but simply by being at the right place at the right time. And that's really what I'm going to talk about a bit, how the development of my own ideas coincided with some of the developments in the field that put me in the right place to be able to write things that had some effect. You know, where everyone's talking about the same thing in our field right now, and in every field perhaps, it's the COVID pandemic. Is there cinema today, right now? Well, at least around my life, we can't go to the movie theaters. I just bought my first large screen television. I always tried to keep away from such things so that I would force myself to go to the movies, which is what I love to do. But now I have a new large screen TV in case I need to watch films that way. Are theaters essential to cinema? And what about the 2-hour standard time slot that most films, 90 minutes to 2 hours, have used throughout the history of the art form? Has television made this too obsolete? Maybe 2 hours is just, the feature film is just one option among several others. TV series, as you know, go on for 30 hours or more. And then there are the very short clips that of computer animation, descendants of MTV, music television, let's say. If cinema is going to encompass such things and include video games and uploads of home movies and perhaps TikTok clips, which I've never seen, what is left of the cinematic body that we used to love and cherish and nourish with our attention and our devotion? Personally, I guess I would say that just as not every piece of paper that has writing on it is literature, so not every clip of audiovisual file is cinema. This is a philosophical question of nominalism. It's important that cinema studies needs to think about these things. Maybe we need to change our name to media studies, as is happening, as if our object has expanded to dissolve films within a much larger audiovisual complex. I think, as my book, What Cinema Is, makes clear, I think this could be a loss because there's something specific and special about the cinematic art as it has grown up to be. Otherwise, we could end up having our journals publishing articles on best practices in using Zoom, for instance, in this particular webinar. Is that part of our field? Should we be studying that? Somebody should study it, definitely. I think it's extremely important, but maybe somebody in the field of sociology, which I know very little about, or somebody in the history of technology, which I know something about. These fields, sociology, technology, edge up on cinema, but I think only as helpful sub-disciplines. And I think there's something special about what we do that can only be done by close attention to the cinema itself. So I guess I'm suggesting that the disciplines need to be disciplined. They have to be, it's a conservative position I'm taking here, but I've been speaking it. And there's a book that came out just this last week called Post Cinema, Press, and I have the lead article in Film Era, where I talk about the discussions of the end of film studies that I hope is helpful. There's a core that I think is at the basis of cinema studies, which is cinema, and there's a core of cinema, which I think has to do with the development of film texts as generally as works of art, but this includes documentary for sure. To grasp what cinema is, we should start with ontogeny. I was cued by this by Mr. Nuri. The word comes up in my book, What Cinema Is, and it's important to me because it was when I realized that Andre Bazin was such an evolutionary thinker. He thought in terms of actual evolution. He was a student of science as well as the arts. And I could see that evolution got into every aspect of his thinking. So for him, when he asks the question, what is cinema? He's not expecting a definitive answer because he believes that cinema grows into what it is going to be, and it's not finished yet. Byzantium was developed in the 1950s, where he played the idea that cinema's ontogeny replicated that of any human being. It's a brilliant little insight. From birth to death in about 100 years. So he said in 1953, cinema was about 55 years old or 60 years old, and it had become wise. It was now ready to play a mature role in cinema. Before that, it had had a rambunctious childhood in the very earliest years, and a very strong adolescence when it reached the narrative feature film in 1912 to 20 in the late silent period. It reached adulthood with sound and took on a very important role in society, as adults do, in its first years when it was 40 years old, let's say, in the classical period, just before, right around World War. After that, it finally did start to measure up to the wisdom that he thought it had achieved and made it worth more than being an entertainment to study from the outside. It's a clever idea. It suggests in the 1950s, he said, that cinema had risen to take its place alongside the novel as the most important signpost of culture, something that people could go to for direction and for food for thought to help the culture develop. He didn't think of course, he thought theater and poetry and painting were crucial. He's a Frenchman and well-educated, but he didn't think that those art forms played the cultural role that the novel played in our era. He didn't think this was immutable. It had been theater in the 19th century, he thought, but in the mid 20th century, the novel was what people looked to when they really wanted to talk about what direction is culture heading. And he said cinema was now the equal of the novel in this. It hadn't been before. It had been very strong and more popular, but it hadn't had the cultural purchase that it attained when it got to be mature. By the same token, he wrote, and finally, a brilliant little essay, cinema is mortal. It's going to die. It most likely die. And he even guessed that maybe in 20 years, we won't have cinema as we know it, and we'll be laughing at the kind of things we're saying about it now. That wouldn't trouble him, he said, because it's a technological art, unlike the human arts of drama, which comes from people putting on skits for each other from the time of the cavemen to our own day, or poetry, which comes from singing and from reciting that people just do out of their own bodies. But cinema is a technological art, and it will die as the technology, or it will alter itself as the technology changes. It's in principle quite mortal. So that's his view. He didn't regret that. He thought something new would come about. He was more interested in the place of human beings in their relationship to art, and he thought in his period, cinema was the art to study because he could watch it alter itself and alter the other arts because of when he was born. So his view of the ontogeny of cinema takes me in two directions, quite distinct. And the first one is the one we should spend our time on that is, what do you think? All of you who are listening in, what do you think about the development of cinema today? What is it becoming as it takes on and runs into new art forms and new socials to adapt to in order to grow and to become what it will be? Or is it really at the end of itself and it'll be taken apart and reappear as fragments of other forms, social forms, and already is doing so in video games or the kind of new media that you all know more about than I do. That's one direction, is to discuss where cinema is headed as it has moved away from the novel no longer being quite so important as it was in his day. My second direction is more personal, and this is what I have been asked to talk about. And you'll have to forgive me for spending the time on myself, but that's what I was asked to do. And it is a little bit of a recapitulation of some aspects of film studies. Cinema study has its own ontogeny. And I also think it might have the same length of time, lifespan as a human being. That human being happens to be me. I by happenstance, happened to be born at such a moment so that I grew into becoming a graduate student at the time that cinema studies was taking hold in universities and in in societies that studied it and in journals that were devoted to it. Of course, there were huge and tremendous film ideas before 1950. But in the 50s, when you have the development of journals like Cahiers du Cinéma in England, in France, and Sight and Sound in England, and Film Quarterly in the United States, and many other places, we suddenly have some sophisticated ideas that start to get coordinated. And I've always thought that the work of Jean Mitry, an early friend of mine, is crucial here, because in 1965, he had published, right in those first few years of the 60s, 5 volumes of the history of cinema and 2 volumes called Esthétique et Psychologie du Cinéma about the film theory, where he put together encyclopedias of all ideas and about all films, he thought. And that was a kind of groundwork, a foundation from which serious film study could begin. I'm not sure if that's true, but it served that role, and actually was the starting point for Christian Metz and the French school of structuralism that came after Mitry. Well, I learned French by reading Mitry, I guess, and I began to look at films through my Cine Club at the university in the late 60s, and did my dissertation when I was starting to teach film at the University of Iowa on André Bazin and his ideas. I did this, personally, you don't need to know this, but I did this in part because I had a strong background in philosophy, especially Catholic philosophy and some theology. And I knew a lot of literary criticism, especially that coming out of the French tradition, that would be part of that. I could understand Bazin's metaphors and his writings better than my students could, because they didn't have that background. Most of them didn't. So I really studied as much as I could about from Henri Bergson up into the Charles Péguy, up to Bazin's time, to try to put Bazin's ideas into a philosophical and theological context so that his notions of realism would be clear. And that was my dissertation, which I never published, but it's the foundation of my work, really. In 1973 and 74, I went to Paris for the first time I got a passport. And in that period, for a couple of years, I both wrote the major film theories, just doing 1 chapter per month, because I had been teaching film theory and I wrote about Bazin. I could write clearly about him. I had to learn about the other theorists that are discussed there. And at the same time, I researched the biography of Bazin, since I knew quite a lot about his ideas. I got to know Francois Truffaut, because he was impressed that someone would spend a dissertation on his foster father, really. So he put me in touch with many, many great, all of the famous filmmakers from that period, Alain Resnais and Eric Romer and Chris Marker. All of them I got to meet and talk about Bazin with them. So it was a fantastic experience of learning that. I was also sitting in the seminar of Christian Metz, who was just developing his ideas about le signifiant imaginaire, the imaginary signifier, the second stage of his own film theory. So I was involved also in the development of French film theory in the early 70s. When I came back to the US, I published the major film theories and the biography of Bazin. It gave me many openings. I got to talk to Orson Welles, who was supposed to write the preface for it, not because of me, but because Truffaut asked him to do that. I got to meet Jean Renoir just before he died. And so it was very important to me to be with Bazin at that point, even while his own reputation in the field of film studies had dropped dramatically. People were not reading Bazin, and I didn't really even teach him then. This was a period of structuralism and post-structuralism, and his people associated him with realism and with the auteur, both topics of which were being demoted in the late 70s and early 80s. But in that period, and I think the most important period for my own work, and I even believe it's a crucial period generally in film studies and literary studies, is 1975 to 85. I'll be teaching a Yale seminar next semester about Paul Ricoeur and Frederick Jameson, whose work really grew there. Jameson worked on allegory, Ricoeur worked on metaphor. These were crucial to me. And I studied as much as I could how film studies could profit from these two literary and philosophical scholars. So I guess the next moment of my career that's important to me was 1984 and 85. And I had 2 books come out at that time Well, the first was this complementary book to major film theories called Concepts in Film Theory, which is my way of trying to explain for students and for myself. I needed to try to figure out how all the new topics in structuralist film theory related to traditional ones. It ends with two major terms. One is interpretation and the other is figuration. So after going through questions of representation, signification, identification, and so on, all the big words that were being used in so-called French grand theory to explain how films are determined by by processes that are larger than human, I came back to very humanist ideas of artworks being figured as proposed solutions to problems that we don't quite understand. And I wanted to explore, I thought I had been exploring films as beautiful solutions to something which we are still struggling to figure out. We don't know what we're asking even. And art moves into these dark and foggy zones and comes up with elegant solutions or ways of dealing with incomprehensible and difficult mysteries. And I loved certain films that did that, not the common genre film, because those were simple solutions to problems we already understood, but works that were more experimental in their narrative form. And so I published what probably is the personally most favorite book of mine, which is Film in the Aura of Art, with essays about Mizoguchi, about Vigo, the filmmakers that I loved, Orson Welles. And I tried to make the articles themselves, interpret them in ways to show how the figurations in the film led to an understanding of not just human problems, but also what cinema could do and was. Why was it working in the way that it was that proved to produce such satisfying and long-lasting works as these? So I didn't think and don't think that cinema is a standard art. I think it's quite different from normal arts, but it does serve some artistic functions that have gone on since time immemorial. The other aspect of this is, I've already used the word, interpretation or hermeneutics. This I picked up especially from Paul Ricoeur, but also a bit from Jameson. And so it suggested to me that the way we advance as film scholars in culture is not to try to get to basic principles that you can get at through logic or even semiotics, but to interpret films. And the interpretation of films is the development of our own sense of the growth of medium through the growth films continue to grow in what they mean on the backs of interpretations that mount up year after year. So while I wrote about the film Sunrise, for instance, in 1978 originally, I continued to write about it later on and did so on the backs of interpretations by scholars like Marianne Doan and Phil Rosen and others who have written about it. And when I reapproach the film today, both I and the film have grown in relationship to it. And this is a recurrent idea that is maybe fairly common, but I still think it's the main work that film scholars have. And so those were two important and coordinated ideas for me that came out in '85. And at that moment, 1985 is a crucial year in the history of film studies, and for two reasons. One, it's the year that Gilles Deleuze finished his two-volume cinema books. And it's also the year that in the United States, David Bordwell and Kristen Thompson and Janet Steiger wrote The Classical Hollywood Cinema, a tremendously powerful book in terms of how to study cinema being part of what they thought of as a human system that has ways you can study it logically. Bordwell was my student, actually. He was my first student. And so we've stayed in touch. We had very different views on many things, but I admire that book. And it's quite opposed to the Deleuze books, but those two monumental books really shaped, I think, what happened for the next 10 years. I'll jump quickly to 1995. And because in the meantime, in the 10 years between 85 and 95, I ingested Deleuze's books and was teaching him. I wrote a lot about Deleuze, actually. I got tired of him and of writing about it, but he's still magnificent. I go back to it, but it was an important period. But most important for me at this period was to try to move in my idea of interpretation from the individual film, like Sunrise or La Talente of Vigo or Jules et Jim of Truffaut, films that I spent a lot of time with, to try to move from those to cultural history, try to get rid of the idea that, not rid of, but to transcend the idea that that a film exists only in isolation, although I think you can study it, as I was doing, film at a time. I continue to do that, the development, the growth of cinema in a particular cultural place. It's not that we have direct communication with an author. There are lots of mediating situations. And so the whole cultural milieu that a film comes out of and the one into which it is received makes a great deal of difference in how it develops. That the film has its own ontogeny. Each film, in a way, is like a person that grows and develops depending on who encounters it and how it responds to those encounters in the writing of criticism and in the discussions that follow. So I picked a specific time and period. I was always involved in France in the 1930s, the era of the Front Populaire, the Popular Front. And I studied and went to France a number of times and wrote two very large books about France in the 1930s. The first of which came out, if we can get this one. It's called Mists of Regret. It's a very large book. It's my most scholarly book, lots and lots of footnotes. And I still like it. I really know the French film of the 1930s in relationship to the period. And a second book I did with a colleague called Popular Front Paris came out about 10 years after that. So that's my deep knowledge, is that period. But it put me in touch with the new historiography of Le Goff and Michel de Certeau, mostly French scholars, Carlo Ginzburg, the Italian, and I really enjoyed learning about how to do film history through the lens of interpretation theory that I've already discussed. At the same time, in 1995, those books came out. Mists of Regret came out in 95. I also was collecting all of Andre Bazin's writings, and this has finally resulted in the complete works of Bazin. It took us 25 years to get them out. Two vast volumes of almost Bazin wrote in his 15 years of writing have now been collected in French. And it was I and actually my family, my daughter and a son, who went and they Xeroxed almost everything they could find. And then with the help of the British Film Institute, we put together a huge Bazin collective archive at Yale. And there was one in France that my colleague Hervé Joubert-Laurenson worked on. And he's the one that produced this definitive edition. Doing that brought me back to Bazin at a time when he was coming back because of the digital concerns that people had about what cinema is. And so I began to talk about Bazin again. I hadn't done that for 20 years. I kept quiet about him, thinking that he was not of interest to people and I didn't want to force him down people's throats. But suddenly people were asking what is cinema, and the question of the ontology of the photographic image and questions of the evolution of art forms began to reappear, and people were mentioning his names. And I had access to all of his writings, and I found fantastic things in the 3,000 articles, because most people had only read there were only about 220 available in French or English. Up to that huge percentage of his work hadn't been translated yet or been even collected. So with that, I was able to put together a series of conferences and a big book called Opening Bazin in 2012, which is the same time that What Cinema Is came out. The other book that I'm so happy has been released in Persian translation, because that's really where I say what I think, I guess. I'm not sure how well I say it. I hope it's really well translated. But I did my best to try to suggest that cinema is a very special something which is not a quasi-art, not quite an art, but something special that we shouldn't lose, even as the medium changes and we become more interested in spectacle than in the pursuit of cinema as instrument of discovery of the world and of human interiors. So all that happened in 2012 and 10 and 12 and so on. And I continue since then to work on topics that Bazin opens up for me. I translated his work on what I call his new media, 3D, television, Cinerama, CinemaScope. And I'm right now finishing a set of translations about his works on adaptation theory and on French and English and Russian literature. He wrote quite a lot about, he was a literary scholar, and they're brilliant things I'm just discovering each moment. So I like to do this. I write long introductions to them. My next project with him will be Bazin and the Cinema of Exploration and Documentary, where there are tremendous essays that are out, and that people are now recognizing that maybe cinema's most important role has been that of pursuing curiosity, allowing human beings to access a world which is larger than they are. And that's how I want to end this, I guess. I've finished an essay which has been translated into Japanese, but I haven't published it in English yet. It's a long essay about the idea of spatial volume in Bazin. But it's not just Bazin. It's what is spatial volume? What is the idea of the cinema taking on a large volume of space and operating within it, as opposed to all the attention that cinema's relationship to time has been given us. So now I'm writing a short history of French film, which is almost finished, and this book on Bazin and adaptation. Let me go back now and then repose this question about cinema's role in the 21st century in relationship to other art forms. So the idea is fairly simple. I'll make it as simple as possible. When cinema arose in the, let's say, the beginning of the 20th century, it emulated or felt it was in competition with or in the same game as theater. For obvious economic and practical reasons. It was staged. And its first relationships were with theater, and it learned a lot from dealing with theater. It, I would say, outgrew that, or it grew into something more and different as it confronted, in the era of sound especially, the novel. And that was what it was when Bazin wrote so often about cinema and novels. He was less interested in 19th century novel adaptation. Pick up some of the moves, the stylistic moves that he found in American novelists like Faulkner and Hemingway, and in André Malraux in his own country, and then in the new novelists like Robbe-Grillet and Nathalie Sarraute and Marguerite Duras. The novel was where things were happening, and he thought cinema was trying, the best cinema, the most interesting, the most powerful cinema was trying to operate with new syntax in order to take up topics that the novel was already working on. And he thought that the cinema might be able to make some gains and to do things that the novel could then learn from as well. And I think that has happened. I think he was quite right. And that's mostly what we teach, I believe. That's why cinema did become mature and was taken up in departments of comparative literature, sometimes even philosophy. And that was why programs in cinema studies developed so thoroughly. But the novel, I'm thinking, and I'm being told, is having its own, I wouldn't say death throes, but its own crisis. And it's easy enough to see that in the era of the cell phone, that some of the things that make the novel important, like suspense, what's going to happen next, have been compromised. That you can't have knowledge of something that other people won't have for later on. In a Jane Austen novel, you know her novels, she sent, this is in the 1805 or so, she sends letters by horseback to confidants or lovers, potential lovers, and they don't get them for several days, and she doesn't get a response for a month. In between, we have two different kinds of times happening, and the difference of those times, the suspense, produces some of the tension that allows the novel to develop what it does. Today, everybody sends a text message as soon as they have a thought, and the other person understands it, and everybody knows everything. So it's very hard to develop the sorts of things that happen in novels in the way they used to. There have been many different kinds of compromises and changes that the novel has undergone to try to alter what it does to deal with the current information world. And sometimes cinema does run up to these. In fact, in a film like Cloud Atlas, there's some other postmodern novels, quite a few that the cinema is adapting. And it is now running into issues of, often into issues of virtuality, where one character may have several lives, some of them virtual, some of them real, artificial intelligence, quick returns, not just flashbacks in the past, but where different time zones coexist. Some of this, though, I think is more related less to the novel's development than to the idea of the computer screen, which has multiple windows on it, and you can move from window to window and have several things happening simultaneously. These are, it's very interesting, and many of you perhaps have already tried to work on films of this sort or on other cultural products, but I think we're in a realm of new forms of organizing information and life patterns that the cinema is having to respond to.
I can close it out now by suggesting something very important to me that I wanted to make sure you heard, because you know all about this, that just as I am trying to figure out how the cinema is reacting to the new art forms or the new media of our era, including video games, that may produce new forms that the cinema may grow into, or maybe the cinema will just dissolve, as we said. But when I think about, when I teach Iranian cinema, which I do in my class on world cinema, I teach a big chunk of it. I adore the films, at least the ones that, a certain segment of them, like many people, I'm really attached to. And I suggest to my students in the US that they need to understand the crucial relationship of cinema to poetry in Iran, the great tradition of Persian poetry continues, not necessarily by the cinema, but the people that are making and watching such films are steeped in a poetic tradition that is way more everyday than it is for us in the US. We don't have a poetic tradition that operates that way. And there had been less, at least until the 1920s and so on, there'd been less of the novel in Iran. And I don't know where the novel stands in Iran, but it's less of a reflex than it is in the US. So if I'm right about the fact that cinema grows on the basis of its relationship to other art forms, it has grown because Iranian cinema has contributed tremendously to it, at least since the 1980s. And it has done so because it has put cinema in touch with a poetic tradition that is not common and goes around the novelistic tradition. And we in the West, in the US anyway, and France recognize the fantastic possibilities of this, but it's not common for us to. So I don't know whether or not this situation is changing in the era of new media and social media and so on there, or whether or not you find yourselves confronted with the same kinds of issues that that I was talking about that face US scholars. And excited to learn about Farabi, and knew just the tiniest things about him, and so I will now look much more deeply into him. What is especially impressive is his sounds like very sophisticated interrelationship of imagination to the intellectual faculties. And at the time, I can see in a kind of Neoplatonic way, he might be interested in having the pure intellectual relationship to happiness be a final step that is only achievable through climbing, I guess, a ladder of metaphors and analogies that artworks can help develop. I've always had some attraction to that. I'm also a little disappointed for art in that it's a means, it's a ladder to get to something which pure intellection that philosophers can get to if they think very deeply without art at all. And as I mentioned in my the importance that figuration plays to me, which I get from Erich Auerbach's study of medieval and classical artworks. Figuration is a way, maybe the only way, I think. I don't think there is, I guess I would say, a direct access through intellect to truths or happiness. The other things I would say that make it, that put Farabi in a more difficult position in relationship to modern culture, today's culture, are two things. First is the insistence on the emotion of comfort and happiness. Well, happiness is something else, but the emotions, the issue of comfort, that art exists so that it can lead us to pleasurable feelings and reduce discomfort. And it's hard to imagine, at least in Western art, a world in which most artists are trying to make us uncomfortable, be less complacent with our situation, and maybe try to disturb us in order to reach some higher truth, that art is a kind of goad that produces difficulties. On the other hand, even the most uncomfortable artworks, the novels of Faulkner, for instance, the films of Terrence Malick, let's say, or whatever filmmaker Zhajanka filmmakers that I love. There is a final feeling of genuine happiness that someone has comprehended, that's Ricoeur's term, gotten their arms around, completely understood and made possible our thinking about issues that are uncomfortable. It gives us a way to operate in a difficult world. So I don't know what Farabi would say about that. And of course, he's writing for a different public in an extremely different period. The final thing I would ask, and it's a more uncomfortable question, I guess, because it has to do with the ideologies or the consequences of different religious systems. But I can think of 3 religious systems, maybe 4, if we take Islamic, Catholicism, Byzantine Christianity, and Judaism. They all, as we know, have very different relationships to the image. And it's fascinating that Farabi's main concerns are music and poetry. These are not where images do not really appear. There have been some, and I think at the end of What Cinema Is, I talk about Marie-José Manzin's ideas about the Byzantine icon. These icons were produced in exactly the period of Farabi in the 8th and 9th centuries in Western Europe, especially in Greece, and they are crucial to, she believes, the development of Christianity. People were able to deal with images of the sacred, and it was a kind of what she calls an economy, whereby you could work with images of things and find yourself in relationship to sacred ideas. And that, according to her, and according to Jean-Michel Frodon, the recent editor of Cahiers du Cinéma, has produced the Western idea of motion pictures, that probably without Byzantine and Catholic artworks, even the grotesque artworks of the Middle Ages, they would be hard to have the kind of motion pictures that we have today. You don't get it from the Jewish intellectuals, even if the Jewish entrepreneurs were crucial to Hollywood. They were working with, he thinks, Western ideas of what an icon is and how you can traffic in them and get to something sublime through even deformed icons. So I don't know what Farabi would say about that, and whether or not, and this has always been the question about Iranian cinema and Islamic art itself, is whether or not there is a blockage, any kind of blockage between spectacle and cinema. And the last, I want to add a coda to that, is, in my own view, and I believe with Jean-Louis Camoli, and Bazin said it too, cinema is not a spectacle, and we should be looking for what is not seen in movies. So to that extent, Bazin and certain French theorists that I follow are much closer to maybe an Islamic notion of art than the current Hollywood or even global notion that we should try to make everything visible, which I find kind of grotesque personally. I absolutely believe that constraints always produce new kinds of beauty and new kinds of intelligibility. My view is, as you may know if you've read What Cinema Is that cinema is never depicts the truth. What it depicts is a way to get toward the truth that the viewer is led to. And a beautiful film is one which leads you seductively and intelligently and cleverly to discover things that are not on the screen, but that you are implied and that you need to pursue through the traces that are there. So I definitely think that in films by the Iranian filmmakers that I watch, we definitely are led through constraints to have to imagine what we do not see. So I think that's absolutely the case. It's been true of arts all along. It's true of the films today or in our century of Eric Rohmer and Hong Sang-soo, who's a little bit like Eric Rohmer. You get very reduced and repetitive visual things in order to try to find new variations of human activity and of things that are even beyond the human. So I certainly definitely believe that. And it's one of the reasons I love to watch new Iranian films as they come out. Well, to watch lots of films from lots of places, and to try to identify those moments in the films that you see that you think are fertile enough to pursue. I think that's what I try to teach my students who are just wanting to know what to do with films. As for filmmaking, I don't teach filmmaking. I played around with it a little bit. Mr. Nuri could tell us much more about this, but consequent of what I just said is I would suggest that people try to give themselves exercises that are very constraining and to see how to come up with imaginative solutions. I remember one of your own most famous filmmakers, Abbas Kiarostami, asking his students in England to create films of just a few minutes inside an elevator. They all had to work inside the elevator. That was the constraint. And the solutions that people came up with were fantastic. He got great, I guess, he got great results from taking that little project. And you can see from his other films how he likes those kinds of constraints. I'm not saying that all cinema needs to be this way, but I think for students that don't have finances to find ways to have to deal with constraints is a way to exercise your visual imagination, and that can then play out in other ways later on. So I would still continue to believe that you want to look at the most interesting and powerful films that you can find and keep watching them and talk to people about them. There's nothing better. So yeah, this is exactly what I fear. It's very well stated. It's likely. I think what you say is probably likely that there has been always, as Bazin said, the myth of total cinema, our desire to have the world twice over, the one that we live and then the one that we imagine and can also live in, the virtual world. So I think that may come, and it may be a financial and cultural giant that strides the earth. But for me, cinema will not die, not because of that, but because I think there will still be people who want to work and struggle with film images on a smaller level. That is, I guess, creating works of art with motion pictures. So I never felt that the cinema's greatest moment was when it had the greatest attendance, which would have been 1946. It was a good moment, but not because so many people went to the films. The great moment of 1946 is Paisa of Rossellini. Not that many people saw Paisa, but it's one of the great moments in film history because a small sketchy film made out of 6 little short stories managed to live even today, at least in my classes and on Criterion Cinema on YouTube, everywhere you can see Paisa. So I think there will continue to be Rossellini's in 2030 and 2040. They will not be working in immersive cinema. There may be some great artists that work in immersive cinema, just as there have been in the IMAX and from Avatar on. There's certainly going to be some fantastic entrepreneurs and entertainers that can really develop it. But I personally am going to be looking for, I guess, intelligent cinema that doesn't put us in everywhere to give us the ersatz experience that we could have, that we want to have, but in fact one that is more, I guess, contemplative, where there's some distance required. And that's the difference that I see in art, that you need to have some distance, and immersion eliminates the distance. And I think you're right, it's happening, and that's right, it takes money. And I think you're right, I think it will happen. It's just that I'll be personally a little bit less interested in that. But I never got into this because I was interested in the history of entertainment. I was interested in the history of ideas and in how they are made, and I think they're made with visual figures, visual and oral figures, and that happens in smaller works usually. So that's my position. I want to thank everybody for your patience for listening to me this long. I appreciate it so much. Thank you.